On a quiet autumn morning in the small town of Cedar Hill, the residents awoke to the chilling news of a gruesome murder that had shattered the peace of their close-knit community. Emily Carter, a 37-year-old homemaker, had been found brutally stabbed to death in her own living room. The discovery left everyone in shock, as Emily had always been known for her warmth and kindness. She was the devoted wife of Mark Carter, a successful local businessman and the mother of 2 young children. Their life appeared picture-perfect, until the events of that fateful day unraveled the dark secrets hidden behind the facade. Mark Carter was the first to discover Emily's lifeless body. He had returned home unexpectedly in the middle of the day after receiving a troubling text message from her, something out of the ordinary. When he walked into their home, the sight that greeted him was beyond comprehension. Emily lay on the floor, surrounded by a pool of blood, her face frozen in an expression of terror. The knife still protruded from her chest, a stark symbol of the violence that had ended her life. Mark's panicked call to 911 brought the Cedar Hill Police Department to the scene within minutes. Detective Laura Mason, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving even the most perplexing cases, took charge of the investigation. The crime scene was meticulously examined, and the absence of forced entry suggested that Emily might have known her attacker. As the officers canvassed the neighborhood, they encountered a mixture of disbelief and fear. No one could fathom who would want to harm the friendly, outgoing Emily. As Detective Mason delved into Emily's life, she found herself piecing together a puzzle of a woman who seemed to have everything but was missing something crucial. Emily had been a devoted wife and mother, but those close to her noticed subtle changes in her behavior over the past year. She had become more withdrawn, often lost in thought, and there were whispers among the neighbors that her marriage to Mark wasn't as idyllic as it appeared. The Carters had moved to Cedar Hill 5 years ago, seeking a quieter life away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Mark's business had flourished, allowing them to buy a beautiful home in the most coveted part of town. Emily, who had previously been a career woman, chose to become a stay-at-home mom, dedicating herself to raising their children and supporting Mark's endeavors. But as time went on, it became evident that the transition was not as smooth as everyone believed. While Mark was often away on business trips, Emily found herself increasingly isolated. The loneliness that crept into her life was something she couldn't shake, despite her best efforts to keep up appearances. And then, about a year ago, everything changed when the Parker family moved in next door. The Parkers were a young couple with 2 teenage sons, and they quickly became a part of the neighborhood's social fabric. The elder son, Ryan Parker, had just turned 21 and was working part-time while taking a gap year before college. He was charming, with a bright smile and an easygoing demeanor that made him popular among the neighbors. But no one noticed when Ryan began to spend more time with Emily. It started innocently enough. He would help her with yard work or run errands for her when Mark was away. But soon, their interactions grew more frequent and their bond deeper. Detective Mason interviewed Ryan as part of the routine questioning of neighbors, and his answers seemed straightforward. He expressed his shock and sadness over Emily's death, recalling how kind she had been to him and his family. He admitted that they had become friends over the past year, often chatting over coffee, but insisted that there was nothing more to their relationship. He even provided an alibi for the time of the murder, stating that he had been at his part-time job at the local bookstore. But something about Ryan's demeanor didn't sit right with Detective Mason. He was too calm, too composed for someone who had just lost a close friend in such a violent manner. She decided to dig deeper into his background and relationship with Emily. As Mason continued her investigation, she uncovered something that shifted the direction of the case. A neighbor mentioned seeing Ryan's car parked outside the Carter residence late at night on several occasions. Another reported noticing the 2 of them taking long walks together in the nearby woods. These sightings were small pieces of a puzzle that hinted at a relationship much more intimate than what Ryan had let on. Mason's curiosity piqued. She requested surveillance footage from the bookstore where Ryan claimed to have been during the time of the murder. As she waited for the footage, she turned her attention back to Mark Carter. He was devastated, his grief palpable, but there was a lingering tension in his responses to her questions. Mark was quick to point out how much he loved his wife, but he also hinted at marital troubles, mentioning that they had been seeing a counselor for the past few months. When Mason pressed him further, Mark admitted that their marriage had been strained. He had noticed Emily becoming distant and preoccupied. There were arguments, most of them stemming from his frequent absences and her dissatisfaction with their life. He suspected she was unhappy, but never imagined she would seek solace elsewhere. The first cracks in Emily's perfect life were beginning to show, but the true extent of her secret would soon come to light. When the surveillance footage arrived, it provided the first major break in the case. Ryan's car was indeed at the bookstore on the day of the murder, but there was a gap in time, roughly 2 hours, during which he left the store and wasn't seen on camera. As Mason confronted Ryan with this new information, his calm facade began to waver. He stumbled through his explanation, insisting that he had just gone out for lunch and returned. But Mason knew she was close to uncovering the truth. She needed more, and she knew exactly where to look. Detective Mason's instincts told her that Ryan Parker was hiding something crucial. With his alibi now in question, she needed to establish a concrete timeline of events on the day of the murder. She decided to go through Emily's phone records and found a series of text messages exchanged between her and Ryan. The messages were flirty and suggestive, revealing a hidden relationship that went far beyond friendly neighborhood chats. On the day of her murder, Emily had sent a final message to Ryan at around 11:30 a.m. "Mark is gone. Come over." This was the message that had sent Ryan rushing to the Carter home, and it provided a clear indication that the affair was not only real but ongoing. The time matched the gap in Ryan's alibi, placing him at the scene during the window of opportunity for the crime. With this new evidence, Mason decided it was time to bring Ryan in for a more intensive interrogation. Sitting across from him in the stark, fluorescent-lit room at the police station, she laid out the evidence she had gathered so far: the surveillance footage, the suspicious time gap, and now, the incriminating text messages. Ryan's confident demeanor cracked as he realized the net was closing in on him. "I told you I didn't kill her," Ryan exclaimed, his voice rising. "Yes, I went over there, but when I got there, she was already dead." Mason leaned forward, her gaze unflinching. "If you didn't kill her, then why did you lie about your alibi, Ryan? Why didn't you call the police when you found her?" Ryan hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "I panicked. I knew how it would look. A young guy like me, having an affair with a married woman, and then she ends up dead? No one would believe me." Mason watched him carefully. "So you just left her there, bleeding out on the floor?" Ryan nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "I know it sounds bad, but I didn't know what else to do. I wiped down the knife and door handles, then I ran." "Wiped down the knife," Mason repeated, her voice calm but firm. "So you did touch the weapon." Ryan's face went pale as he realized his mistake. I didn't kill her," he stammered. "I just didn't want my prints on anything. I didn't kill her, I swear." Mason knew she had to tread carefully. Ryan's story was full of inconsistencies, but it wasn't a confession. She needed more evidence to lock him down for the crime. She decided to follow up on one more lead: the knife itself. Forensic analysis had already shown that the knife belonged to the Carters, part of a set kept in their kitchen. But there was something else that had caught the lab's attention. They found a small piece of torn fabric caught in the handle of the knife, something they had initially overlooked. It was a clue that could potentially tie the killer to the scene in a more definitive way. Mason ordered a comparison of the fabric with Ryan's clothing, but the results were inconclusive. Frustrated but not defeated, she continued to dig into every piece of evidence she could find. As the investigation progressed, Mason discovered that Emily had been planning to leave her husband and start a new life with Ryan. This revelation added a new dimension to the case, providing a possible motive for murder. If Ryan knew Emily was serious about leaving Mark, he might have felt pressured or threatened, possibly leading to a confrontation that spiraled out of control. The breakthrough came when a neighbor mentioned something they had seen on the morning of the murder. An older woman who lived across the street from the Carters recalled seeing someone wearing a dark hoodie running from the house around noon, just about the time Ryan had claimed to have found found Emily. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it seemed crucial. With this new piece of information, Mason searched through surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses. After hours of reviewing footage, she spotted it, a grainy image of someone running through an alley wearing a dark hoodie. The person's face was obscured, but the footage clearly showed them heading in the direction of Ryan's home. The hoodie looked similar to one Mason had seen hanging in Ryan's closet during an earlier search of his residence. When confronted with this evidence, Ryan's resolve broke. He sobbed, recounting his version of what had happened that day. According to him, when he arrived at the Carter home, Emily seemed agitated, almost frantic. She had been pressuring him to leave his family and start fresh with her, something he wasn't ready to do. They argued, the tension between them escalating quickly. Ryan claimed that in her anger, Emily grabbed the knife from the kitchen and threatened to kill herself if he didn't agree to her demands. He tried to take the knife from her, and in the struggle, she accidentally fell, and the knife plunged into her chest. Ryan panicked, horrified by what had just happened. He knew no one would believe it was an accident, especially considering their affair. So he fled, wiping down the knife and anything he thought he might have touched. Mason listened carefully. Ryan's story painted him as a man caught in a desperate situation, but it didn't align with the brutality of Emily's wounds. The single, deep stab wound suggested a deliberate action, not an accident. She pressed him again, harder this time, but Ryan stuck to his story, refusing to admit to anything more. With no clear confession and only circumstantial evidence, the case seemed to hit a dead end. But Mason wasn't ready to give up. She decided to conduct a re-examination of the crime scene, focusing on the path Ryan might have taken when fleeing. Her persistence paid off when she found something hidden in the bushes near the back entrance, a pair of blood-stained gloves. The gloves were sent to the lab, and the results were damning. DNA analysis revealed that the blood on the gloves belonged to Emily, and Ryan's fingerprints were found on the inside. It was the missing link Mason needed. The gloves, along with the torn fabric and Ryan's inconsistent statements, painted a picture that was hard to dispute. With this new evidence, Mason confronted Ryan one last time. Faced with the undeniable proof, Ryan finally broke down. He admitted that he had lied about what happened. They had argued, and in a fit of rage, he had stabbed her. It wasn't premeditated, he insisted, but it was no accident either. He had been consumed by anger and fear of losing everything if Emily revealed their affair. It was over. Ryan Parker was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The trial that followed gripped the small town of Cedar Hill. The affair, the murder, and the shocking betrayal became the talk of the town. Ryan was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for 20 years. With Ryan Parker behind bars, the courtroom drama that followed captured the attention of the entire community. The prosecution presented a strong case, painting Ryan as a young man who had been driven by rage and desperation when Emily threatened to expose their affair. They argued that Ryan's fear of losing everything, his family's trust, his future, and his reputation, pushed him to commit the ultimate act of violence. The forensic evidence was the linchpin of the prosecution's case. The blood-stained gloves found near the crime scene, with both Emily's blood and Ryan's fingerprints, were undeniable proof of his involvement. The prosecution also emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime by highlighting the knife wound, a single, forceful stab to the chest, indicating a deliberate act, not an accidental struggle as Ryan had claimed. The defense, however, tried to paint a different picture. They argued that Ryan had been emotionally manipulated by Emily, who was using their affair to coerce him into leaving his family. They claimed that the murder was not planned, but a tragic result of a heated confrontation that got out of hand. They leaned heavily on Ryan's initial story of an accidental stabbing, suggesting that in the confusion and panic, he fled the scene without thinking clearly. Despite these efforts, the jury seemed unconvinced. The prosecution's narrative of a young man pushed to his breaking point by the fear of exposure and the cold reality of the evidence overshadowed the defense's argument. The text messages between Emily and Ryan confession, filled with desperation and emotional turmoil, only served to reinforce the notion that Ryan had been unable to handle the pressure of his double life. The turning point in the trial came when the prosecution presented the timeline leading up to the murder. They meticulously reconstructed the events of that day, showing how Ryan had lied about his whereabouts, how he had arrived at the Carter home after being summoned by Emily, and how his rage and panic culminated in the brutal act. They showed the jury the last text Emily had sent to Ryan: "We need to talk. I can't live like this anymore." The implication was clear. Emily was ready to expose their affair, and Ryan, faced with the destruction of his life, chose to silence her instead. The most damning testimony came from the forensic pathologist who had examined Emily's body. She explained that the depth and angle of the wound indicated a forceful, intentional stab, not a random result of a struggle. The jury listened intently as she described how Emily would have died within minutes from the severe internal bleeding caused by the wound. There was no way she could have inflicted it on herself accidentally. Ryan, sitting in the defendant's chair, looked pale and defeated. His initial bravado had long since faded, replaced by a haunted expression as he listened to the details of the crime he had tried so desperately to cover up. The weight of his actions seemed to bear down on him, and when he took the stand in his own defense, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I loved her," he said, his eyes filled with tears, "but she was going to ruin everything. I didn't mean to do it. It just happened so fast." But his words couldn't undo the evidence or the pain he had caused. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Ryan Parker was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with a chance of parole after 20. The sentence, though severe, did little to heal the wounds left in the wake of Emily's death. The aftermath of the trial was devastating for both families. The Parkers, once well-liked in the community, faced the shame and stigma of having a murderer for a son. They sold their house and moved away, unable to bear the whispers and stares of their neighbors. Mark Carter, now a single father, struggled to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. He moved his children out of Cedar Hill, hoping to give them a fresh start far away from the painful memories that haunted their old home. Detective Laura Mason, who had been instrumental in solving the case, couldn't shake the feeling of sadness that lingered even after justice was served. She knew that there were no winners in this case, only broken lives and fractured families left in the aftermath of one man's reckless actions. As she stood outside the courthouse on the final day of the trial, Mason thought about Emily's last moments. She had been a woman trapped by her own choices, reaching out for something that could never fulfill her. In the end, her desperation had led her into the arms of a man who, when faced with losing everything, chose to take her life instead.